Hi there, I'm Reed Peterson, and welcome to Grief Refuge. Thank you so much for joining me. And whether this is your first or your 150th time listening, I so appreciate you joining me. You're definitely in for a treat because at Grief Refuge, what we do is we really like to take it deep. We like to sit with the emotional experience of grief so that you can feel. So, with that said, if you're multitasking, if you're cruising around town in your vehicle, you're out on a jog, you're washing those dishes, you're folding laundry, I'm actually going to ask you to stop. I'm going to ask you to not multitask. I'm going to ask you to find a comfortable seat or even lay down, close your eyes, pop in those earbuds, and just be with your grief. I also want to say that I appreciate your listenership rather deeply. It means so much to me that you trust my support and the words that I have to share, whether it's my own insights or it's a conversation I have with another professional in this grief care industry. But it's all meant for you. It's all meant for your well-being. It's all meant for your healing. It's all meant for honoring your grief. And thank you for being a part of this experience. I have a special guest today, and before we dive into that interview, I want to mention the focus product that Grief Refuge has been making available to the public. It's called Grief Refuge, and it's a mobile application. It's an app you can download on your phone, your smartphone, whether it's made by Apple iPhone or it's made by Google Android. And the app is available in the App Store, and it's a free download. There's a lot of free features, and there are some paid features too. But all of the features are intended to further help support your internal grieving process. And what I mean by internal is it's like the psychology of your grief. It's really going inward and focusing there. So many people get grief support from external sources, and those are all fantastic. So perhaps you're working with a counselor, a therapist, or you're in a support group, whether it's facilitated by a professional in the industry, or it's facilitated by somebody who would be called peer-to-peer support, someone who has had a loss similar to yours. All of these are fantastic. And in addition to that, there's a lot of internal stuff going on too. And so that's where Grief Refuge really stands out as additional support. It's a very unique thing in this grief care space, and it's definitely worth your time to explore. So go to your phone's app store, search for Grief Refuge, and download it today to get started. Okay, cool. Now that that's been said, we're going to move on to the conversation today. The tragedy of loss, it has an impact on people being more compassionate and empathetic, especially with others. Grief Refuge, it actually wouldn't exist today if I never responded to a calling I had after the loss of my stepfather. There are many reasons why the loss of someone special makes people want to do kind and caring things. Regardless of the reason, it's a very beautiful thing for this to happen. Today, I want to introduce you to the work of Andrèa Grace Phillips and Griefway. Griefway is an organization that guides grievers to live well through grief and loss. The whole organization is owned by Andrèa Grace Phillips, and in our interview, she will share more about her grief over the loss of her son Roman, and also the services that Griefway provides, such as retreats, groups, and one-to-one support. Please enjoy the conversation. It's filled with compassion and it's filled with care. Today, I'm joined by Andrèa Grace Phillips of Griefway, and I'm so happy you're here, Andrea. Welcome to Grief Refuge.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Andrea, I've come to learn more about you and the services you provide and what I would call a philosophy of Griefway that you offer to people that you serve. I'm really pumped you're here, and I want to tell you exactly why, because I know your heart is huge, and I know you have a very important message to share. And you shared a little bit about your backstory with me and some of your own personal losses. Can you share with our listeners a little bit more of who you are and where you came from in order to get to this point of where you are now?
Absolutely. So I am the mother of an only son named Roman, and Roman had a very long journey in his 27 years of life. It included a lot of trauma in his childhood that eventually developed into the disease of a substance use disorder, incorporating multiple substances and a very tumultuous life. His addiction began when he was approximately 15, but it really began much sooner than that, given the trauma that he'd experienced in his childhood. It just didn't come to light until the addictive behavior started. But after nearly a decade or so of that journey that he was on with his substance use disorder, he had multiple life-threatening overdoses, and he experienced homelessness and incarceration and job losses and ongoing trauma throughout that decade. And finally, he got to a place where he was no longer able to go on. And he called me one day and just said, "Mom, I don't think I'm going to make it any longer." And I heard something different in his voice in that moment. He was in Texas at the time, and I was living in Indiana, which is where I am now in Evansville. And I decided to get in the car and start driving to Texas. So I went down and picked him up because I knew that he was considering ending his life at that point. And because I had never heard that sound in his voice, and as a mother, I just had an instinct that that's what I was hearing at that time, was just a desperate, potentially suicidal plea. I chose to drop everything and go immediately to get him, which I did, and brought him back to my home. And he spent the next 8 months living with me and my family, my husband and my bonus children. And he went to treatment. He was able to get sober and be healthy for a brief period of time before he passed away in our home due to the complications from a decade long of abuse with various substances. And so through that was actually 4 years ago now, and we found him peacefully asleep. And he had had some heart events that had happened because people that use opioids often have a great damage that's done to their heart, similar to alcohol and a person's liver. And so generally his heart just gave out and he passed peacefully from that occurrence. And since that time, we celebrated his life very uniquely. We had a service in our backyard. We had a bonfire. We had communion. We had just a beautiful life celebration in Indiana. And then we had another one in Minnesota, where he had lived most of his childhood and where I am from as well, and as well as you are, Reed. So we have that affinity. And then we actually had an opportunity to spread his ashes in the river in Delano, Minnesota, where he had fished as a young boy. And that felt appropriate to us because that was the last time that we really could remember him experiencing joy in his life. And we wanted that to be the place that we would go back and visit to remember him. So I've been on my own personal journey with grief really prior to his passing, honestly, because there is a lot of grief as children are growing and things are changing for them, and when they experience trauma and their lives are altered in ways that cause them to not function on a normal path or a normal journey, we grieve those losses. So I believe that I started grieving long before he passed, actually. And I had been working in the addiction industry and space as an advocate and working with other families. I became a coach, a certified life coach, and a family recovery coach a few years prior to his passing, because I just wanted to be able to help other people that were on a similar journey to myself. And so when he died, I knew that my focus was going to shift from helping families that were in an active addiction kind of stage to families that had actually lost a loved one, whether it was a child or a spouse or a sibling, immediate family member. And so now for the last several years, that's what I've been doing, and have just considered it an honor and a very unique calling, because I don't think anybody wakes up or grows up and says, gosh, I really want to help people in a grief space kind of way for the rest of my life. It's just a very unique place to be, but I feel that it's just a sacred honor every day, and every family that I encounter or individual that I'm able to journey alongside on this path.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I am deeply touched by your story in honoring Roman, and also just hearing how you, if it's okay to use this word, embrace the difficulty, embrace the challenge, and embrace continued love throughout such a hard life. And I apologize for saying hard, because I understand that that may be a judgment. But if I put myself in the shoes of Roman, that I would say I have a hard life. And I am so curious if it's okay to probe a little bit in the sharing of your personal experience with Roman, and perhaps having the phone conversation that helped you recognize there was really something different in the sound of his voice, and that prompted you to drive down to Texas and get him and bring him back to your current home, and he can live the rest of his days more in I guess I would say a peaceful and loving, comforting environment with you and your family. That thing about the sound in his voice, I'm going to put myself in your shoes for a second too, and I'm trying to empathize, and I apologize if I'm projecting on this, but when you heard that and the way you tell that story to all of us listening, I don't hear a lot of fear in your voice, but I would assume that I would be so scared, because my only child is pretty much looking at like his life coming to an end. And I'm just so curious if you're willing to share, Andrea, how did you find a balance between like the love you felt and knowing that you were going to provide care, and also managing what may have been fear, being so scared, or concern, or whatever it is that you would call it, as you cared for Roman in the towards the end of his life?
Well, I think I would first say that anyone that loves someone that struggles with a substance use disorder is very familiar with the adrenalized ride that you are on, because there are so many crises that occur when someone is struggling. Often there are major events, car accidents or job losses or injuries, overdoses, things like that. So you become sort of used to that ride and what it's like to operate at a highly adrenalized state, which isn't healthy and definitely requires a lot of self-care to manage, but it is part of the journey. And so similar to, I guess, if someone was pinned under a vehicle, and we talk about how people all of a sudden exhibit great feats of physical strength to remove a vehicle or to lift a vehicle up off of somebody that may be pinned under one. It's something kind of like that that kicks in on the inside of you, in your spirit and soul. It's a level of emotional adrenalized capacity that kicks in that instant. And so what I heard in Roman's voice was, first of all, words that he'd never used before. So in a decade of him sharing, because we were really close and I was in regular communication with him, and he was sharing all of the details of the major life events that were going on with him. It was really more than any mother wants to know, but I'm still grateful that he had the courage to share all of the hard things with me in detail, because I think ultimately it allowed me to help him in a greater capacity. But he had never used the words, "Mom, I don't think I'm going to make it much longer." And I thought, well, you've made it through multiple overdoses, through near-death experiences, through multiple, even have been held up at gunpoint, all kinds of very difficult circumstances. And in his current state, he was obese. He was completely consumed with alcoholism, and he was homeless and just staying with a friend, and was really pretty destitute. Excuse me. But he had never said those words, "I don't think I'm going to make it much longer." And it was just enough of a call to action for me to immediately ask the question, "Do you think you can make it until tomorrow?" And because I wanted him to commit to something, because I had a sense of fear and urgency that made me think, he's going to kill himself in the next hour or this evening or soon. Like it felt very urgent. And so when I said, "Do you think you can make it until tomorrow?" And he hesitated a second, but he said, "Yeah, I think I can make it until tomorrow." And I said, "Well, that's how long it's going to take for me to get to you. Like, I'll come right now, but it's going to take me until tomorrow to get to you. And, I don't want to show up to you dead. So I need you to promise that you will stay with me until tomorrow." And so we had that agreement. And when I got off the phone, the first call I made was to his attorney, because he was actually on a type of probation that allowed him to, or required him to not cross over state lines. And I just called the attorney and I said, "I believe my son is in grave danger and is at risk for harming himself lethally. And I want to go and get him and bring him, to my home and get him into treatment. What are the ramifications for myself, for him?" And the attorney actually was astute enough to say to me, "Ma'am, if you think he's going to be dead by tomorrow, do the ramifications matter? And if you don't, go get him." And I just said, "I really appreciate that. I guess we'll deal with whatever the fallout is. If we transport him across state lines and then there's warrants or whatever that were to involve." And I was really grateful in hindsight for a human that had enough compassion to really prioritize appropriately. And then the next call I made was to my husband, who was on his way home from work. And I said, "I have to leave in a few hours. I'm just going to take enough time to get some things together, and then I have to drive to Texas. And I've never driven 16 hours straight in my life. I would imagine, unless you're somebody that, drives for a living, it's probably not a common thing. But I just had such a sense of urgency. So somehow, by the grace of God, there was enough adrenaline to keep me awake long enough to drive straight through. And when I got to him, he was waiting for me outside. He had been just sleeping on the floor of a friend's efficiency apartment in Austin, Texas. And he barely had the strength to stand. He had been standing for half an hour by the time I pulled into the parking lot to get him. And he literally just collapsed in my arms. And he said, "Mom, I'm going to fall on you if I don't get into the car right now." And so I kind of ushered him into the back of the car. I had a big minivan, and I had taken the seats out and made a bed for him. And he laid down, and I started driving. I knew that if I didn't get him outside of the city limits, there was a chance that he would regret his decision, or, be afraid or whatever, and bolt. And so I drove for a few more hours to just be far enough outside of the city. And then we stayed at a hotel for just 4 or 5 hours. And then we drove, back to Evansville. But as we drove, he poured out his soul and really shared with me the details of the plan that he had. And I think that was the hardest part as the mom, because I heard my baby boy, who at this time was so broken and just beyond wanting to even live, making a plan to kill himself that would include his body never being found. So he was planning on shooting himself in the river. And then he would, nobody would find the weapon or him until who knows when, and he would just have been a missing person. And instead, he was a lost person that was found before he died. And I'm just so grateful for the courage that he had to tell me the truth about where he was really at. And that's what honestly makes him my hero. And that's where I draw inspiration to go on with my life and our shared legacy. Now, how I can live well on behalf of both of us, because he had enough courage and enough regard for the relationship that we had to not want to follow through with everything in him that was really wanting to end his life because he couldn't bear the pain anymore. And he also shared with me that he remembered a time that he and I had a conversation about how desperate, depressed, overwhelmed, broken, I can't remember exactly, but we were both feeling overwhelmed by life. And we had made a commitment to one another that neither one of us would choose to end our lives for the sake of the other. If I'm stuck here, you're stuck here too. We're going to figure this out. And I'm not going to leave you here like that. And you're not going to leave me here like that. And in hindsight, I'm really grateful now for those commitments that we made to each other, not realizing that that's really what was happening, because in those really dark moments, those things come back to us. And he remembered that he had made that commitment to me. And he said that was part of why he felt like he had to call and let me know, I am standing on the edge of the abyss. and I am considering jumping, essentially, is what he was saying. But I don't want to do that to you because I promised I wouldn't. None of those words were spoken, but that's what my spirit heard in that moment. And I knew that I had a limited amount of time to get to him because it was grave. So I know that's a lot of information. But this has been our journey and part of our story. And he and I had talked about writing a book together someday about our journey and our story, our shared journey. And I am currently working on that to this day and still feel like we are writing it together, even though he's writing it from the other side. He is still with me in spirit. And so I utilize a lot of those conversations as I am beginning to document our story.
I'm deeply touched, Andrea. I actually feel like I'm at a complete loss for words, but as a listener to your experience, I am aware of so many intricate details that speaks to the special bond that you had and have with your son, despite his life's challenges with substance. And it's just, honestly, I've got goosebumps right now, and it's just really powerful. And now I'm recognizing the emotion come up. So
Yeah.
a second to gather myself. But what I will say is, throughout the receiving and the witnessing, as far as listening to your sharing, I'm also learning more about how one of your gifts, I can recognize one of your gifts is you have a very special listening heart. And I don't have a lot more words to help articulate that thought, but I think that is a gift that you have. And whether that was something you were born with or something that you started developing when your son was born, or throughout the time he started using, I don't know when this came to fruition for you, but it's here now. And I feel like that's what makes things beautiful as far as the services that you offer with Griefway. And we definitely need to talk about that a bit more to help our listeners understand. But I can tell it's such a strong feeling inside me that you're doing what you're meant to be doing in a way.
Well, thank you. I believe I'm doing exactly what I'm meant to be doing. And I am grateful for the great pain that I've experienced in this life, because it has been my greatest teacher, and ultimately is the greatest gift then that I can pass back to other people. I consider myself to be an empath, which, for people that don't know what that means, I just have a heightened sense of how other people are feeling, of the energy in a room of people, and definitely on a one-on-one basis. Sometimes I use the example of the movie The Green Mile, if people have seen that, where the gentleman in the movie could touch someone and literally absorb with their pain, their disease, their whatever was going on in their life, because he just had such an acute sense of how they were feeling and what they were going through. And so all of my life, I have operated in that capacity, but I don't think I understood it well until I was much older. And now, with that sense of where people are at and how they're feeling along their own journeys, I hope to be able to use that information in a way that impacts their life for the greater good, that assists them, helps them, comforts them, guides them in whatever they need in that moment. So I really consider it the entirety of my life's mission to invite people to fully live and engage in their lives, even in the face of great tragedy with the loss of a loved one, whether it's to a substance use disorder or, some other tragedy. Death and the grief that we experience is generally debilitating for most of us. Understandably, great losses alter us. And I would wager that it actually alters us physically, chemically, in addition to spiritually, emotionally. So I now see grief and all that I have experienced within the realm of grief as a profound, sacred space that I desire to be able to journey alongside people along that path, that grief path. And so Griefway was founded with the purpose of inviting people to choose to live and grieve well. So it's just an invitation or an extension of my experience that says, this is an option for you. If you want to choose this for yourself, here are some ways that you can live and grieve well in spite of loss. And it requires a very conscious, intentional effort. So as I am, on my own path with it, and as I encourage others, I am making a choice every day, sometimes moment by moment or hour by hour, of how I want to be impacted by my own grief and how I want to live alongside it, and how I can best honor the loss of Roman's breath by making the most of my own. So that's what I'm really aspiring to do, both individually and then collectively as I, companion with others.
Well said, Andrea. Question for you is, does it feel congruent if you've heard me speak to Griefway as like a philosophy? Does that resonate, or would you call it something else?
I think I would call it a philosophy, an ideology, that's a good question. I call it a way. It's just, it's a way. There are many ways that people experience grief. There are many different paths that people take with it. All of them are chosen, however. And I think sometimes people feel like they don't have a choice, or that grief is something that has befallen them. And certainly tragedy befalls us. It's not something that we seek out. But how we react and respond to those tragedies are, in fact, our choice. And so we get to decide every day which way we want to go with that grief. And I am just inviting people to choose well and wanting to guide them along that path by sharing the things that have worked for myself and the things that I've learned along the way. And they may be appropriate for some or for many, not for all. It's just an option. It's an invitation.
Yeah, I like your choice of word and using invitation, because indeed it is what I've come to learn, and the support that I provide is that a lot of grievers actually don't feel like they have as many choices as they do. And I'm not exactly sure why that is. I have some thoughts about it, but no facts per se, but yet, and then there's other times, I guess, for lack of a better word, when grievers recognize they have a choice, but then they often think into the future as far as if I make this choice and I now have this behavior, or I take this action, I'm going to be perceived in this way, and therefore they don't allow themselves to make the choice. So there's almost like, in the work that I've been doing and having personal interactions with people in the grief space, they almost are concerned about being perceived in a certain way. And it breaks my heart every time, Andrea, because it's their experience, and both of us fully value authenticity in a grieving experience. I know that for a fact. Listeners, Andrea and I have been talking for months and developing, looking for ways to develop an exclusive partnership through the work that we do. And so we've had wonderful conversations as far as what ways we can provide some of, the best grief support possible that we can come up with. But grievers have this fine line of like, I need to have an authentic experience, but at the same time, they're concerned about how they fit in with the rest of the world too. And I feel like that's always a fine-tuned adjustment, because grief is so unique for everybody. But I love how with Griefway and the services that you provide, there is space to honor that, and you name it through what you've called an invitation. So thank you so much for saying that, Andrea. Tell us a little bit more practically about Griefway. You provide some services. What does that mean? What if I'm brokenhearted and I'm suffering from loss, and I were to come to you, how could you help me, is what I'm asking.
Sure. Well, Griefway, again, as a way to live and grieve well, is a series of options for people to partake in. There is, private one-on-one grief guidance or grief companioning. There is a private Facebook group. There are group sessions that will be beginning again. We have done them in the past, and those are starting back up soon. There are retreats that are coming up in multiple cities over the next year we're in the planning stages of, that allow people to come and experience wonderful nurturing and healing and resources from multiple professionals. So as someone chooses to attend a grief retreat, they're going to be able to participate in a space with others that are in a similar place along their journey, and have, the benefit of just focusing solely on themselves and that grief and the resources that they need to best support them along that journey. So you have several different options that you can, reach out to me for. And also, as you mentioned, as we continue to partner and kind of develop this partnership that we have, they are also extended, several of the services that you provide. And I think people will find some combination that works for them. And I believe that I saw a movie recently called Land, and a gal in that movie is grieving greatly, and someone comes along that helps her at a time when she is near death. And she asks him the question, "How did you find me?" And he says, "You were in my path." And so I believe that the people that we are looking to be able to serve will find us, or we will find them, because we will be in one another's paths. And Griefway it's a way, it's a path. So my hope is ultimately to have a great impact in the grief space on potentially a global scale someday. But with humble beginnings, I believe that there is a way to grieve well, to grieve potentially better than many of us are doing it. So again, that invitation is just something that I'm extending to people in multiple different ways, and they can utilize whatever resonates with them as far as the services that are available.
And last question, Andrea, what's the best way for someone to contact you?
They can reach me directly through my email or website, which is just my name, Andrèa Grace Phillips @gmail.com, or they can go to the website, which is actually under construction, but that is also my name right now. We're in the process of developing transitioning a lot of that information over to the Griefway website and domain so that people can be looking for that in the very near future. And I am happy to do, complimentary initial consultations with anyone that is looking for private grief coaching or guidance and that wants additional information about the retreats that are coming up as well.
All right, fantastic. Andrea, you've touched my heart deeply. I'm so grateful our paths have crossed. Thanks for being a part of Grief Refuge.
Thank you so much. Looking forward to all that the future has for us.
Well, isn't Andrea such a kind soul? I so appreciate the work she does and her kind and huge heart. It's full of compassion. And as she once told me in a side conversation that we had, she really has this desire to help everybody. And it's just amazing, especially in today's world. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. This is such an honor for me to hold space for your grief and your healing. Please, if you found this podcast episode to be helpful, let us know. The best thing you can do right now is on your podcast player, leave a rating and leave a review for the Grief Refuge podcast. And before we say goodbye for today, please remember to download the Grief Refuge app. You can grab that app for more grief support. It's a pretty amazing tool to have when grief hits you hard. So if grief is making you feel lost or isolated right now, download the app for free and start feeling more comfort and feeling more support for the inward journey of your grief process. That's going to do it for today. Thank you so much. Take care. Keep honoring your grief. Be kind to yourself and talk to you soon.